On my wedding night, my alpha cheated on me, and that wasn't even the worst mistake I made. The room was dressed in white perfection, every detail curated to signal stability, alliance, inevitability, and I stood in the center of it realizing how clean a lie could look when enough people agreed to believe it. The door had closed behind Riven Ashford without hesitation, and the laughter outside came a moment later, soft, then sharper, then careless enough to confirm what I already suspected. I stepped into the corridor. Not rushed, not uncertain, just done pretending I didn't see the pattern forming. Riven stood there, exactly where he was supposed to be, attention orbiting him, posture relaxed, control effortless, and beside him, an Omega leaned close enough to suggest intimacy without needing to claim it. Someone new, not connected to the family structure, not relevant to the alliance, which meant this wasn't strategy, just preference. You shouldn't be here, Riven said when he noticed me, not moving away, not correcting anything, simply acknowledging me like a misplaced variable. The Omega glanced at me once, then away, as if I had already been categorized and dismissed. No hostility, no need for it. Confidence was enough. He's too boring, Riven added lightly, turning back to his audience, completing the thought like it was obvious. A few people laughed. Some nodded. I watched them instead of reacting. The alignment, the hierarchy, the ease with which they agreed. Nothing had changed, which meant the outcome wouldn't either, unless I changed the starting point. In that life, I stood there longer, tried to interpret intention where there was none, tried to salvage a structure that had never been designed to hold. This time, I turned away first. That moment wasn't the collapse. It was the signal. The collapse came later, quiet, methodical, engineered with precision I should have respected earlier. It began with something reasonable. My stepmother's voice, soft, composed, impossible to reject without seeming irrational. You'll need time to adjust, she said. Let someone else manage the operational load for now. My father agreed. Of course he did. It made sense. That was the point. I didn't object. Not because I trusted her. Because I underestimated the scale. Control didn't disappear. It shifted. Small approvals. Secondary reports. Temporary delegations. Nothing critical on its own. That was the design. I signed the approval. The numbers were clean. Perfect, even. Too perfect. What I handed over didn't destroy us. What replaced it did. Altered data streams. Fabricated projections. Contracts rerouted just enough to remain credible. My father signed decisions built on information that had never existed. By the time discrepancies surfaced, there was nothing left to correct. The structure hadn't cracked. It had been rewritten. And at the center of it, calm, precise, untouched, was the one person I had allowed proximity without scrutiny. Later, her son stepped into the space that had been cleared. Not immediately. That would have been obvious. Gradually. Seamlessly. And by then, Riven had already shifted his attention. What began as convenience became alignment. What looked like coincidence revealed itself as coordination. I didn't misread it this time. The ballroom returned in full, voices, glass, movement, and beside me, my father spoke, low and controlled. Ignore it, Soren. This marriage is important. Important. I almost smiled. Not because he was wrong. Because he was working with incomplete data. I didn't move immediately. I observed. Positioning. Influence. Weak points. The absence of resistance. Then I stepped forward. Not abruptly. Not hesitantly. Precisely enough to redirect attention without demanding it. It worked. It always did, when executed correctly. Conversations thinned. I shifted. Riven noticed. Of course he did. That's new, he said, watching me with mild curiosity. You finally have something to say? I adjusted the cuff of my sleeve. Small movement. Controlled. I always did, I replied evenly. You just didn't find it useful. A pause. Subtle, but real. He exhaled a short laugh. Don't start pretending now. You're not built for this. Built for this. I considered that for half a second, then dismissed it. I agree, I said. That was enough to disrupt expectation. Just enough. I'm not built for inefficiency. Silence followed. Focused now. Intentional. Good. They were listening. This arrangement, I continued, letting my gaze move across the table, the room, the stakeholders, was constructed under the assumption that long-term alignment was optional. A few older guests straightened. They understood the implication. That assumption does not hold. I reached for the ring, removed it smoothly, placed it on the table between us. No force, no emphasis, just a conclusion. Continuing this engagement introduces unnecessary risk. A sharp intake of breath somewhere behind me. My father went still. Riven didn't move. He was recalculating. Finally, "You don't get to walk away like that," he said, voice lower now, edged with something less controlled. I looked at him properly this time. Not as a partner, as a misjudgment. "You didn't reject me," I said calmly. "You just failed to understand what you were given." That landed exactly where it needed to. His jaw tightened. The room shifted again, quieter, sharper. "You think anyone else would take you?" he added, because he had to. Because control, once threatened, always looks for a way back. I allowed a brief pause. Enough to make the answer deliberate. "Someone who values structural integrity over temporary preference might," I said. Then I shifted my gaze. Past him, past the noise, to the one variable that had always mattered more than the rest. Alaric Ashford stood at the edge of the room, exactly where I expected him to be. Unmoving, observing, not intervening prematurely. In my previous life, he had identified the breach before it became collapse. He had spoken, and no one listened. This time, I would. I stepped toward him, measured, intentional, not submissive, not confrontational, precise. The room still behind me. I could feel it, uncertainty spreading where certainty had been. Good. Let them adjust. "This alliance," I said, voice quieter now, directed only at him, "was never about appearance." I stopped at a distance that acknowledged his position without diminishing mine. "So I would prefer to discuss it with the one who actually defines its outcome." Silence settled. Not empty. Waited. He studied me, longer than necessary, evaluating not my words, but the reasoning behind them. "You speak," he said finally, voice low, controlled, "as if you already understand the structure." I met his gaze without hesitation. "I understand where it failed," I replied. A pause. Then, quieter, final. "And I have no intention of repeating that error." The space between us held. Not fragile. Decisive. And for the first time, the future I remembered was no longer mine. The door was already open. Of course it was. Nothing in Alaric Ashford's space relied on permission. The room was quiet, stripped to essentials, every line deliberate. He stood by the window, the city laid out beneath him like something already accounted for. I stepped in and let the door close behind me. I didn't speak. Not yet. I observed. Not the suit. Not the posture. The absence of hesitation. This wasn't inherited authority. This was built. At 20, he had taken a company already marked for collapse and dismantled it with surgical precision. Sold what couldn't be sustained, buried what would have dragged it under, cut alliances that existed only to weaken it, and rebuilt what remained into something no one could challenge. Not clean. Not gentle. Effective. Most men protected power. He reshaped it, and never lost control again. This was not a man you trusted. This was a man you aligned with. "You didn't react," he said without turning. "You redirected." Not a question. I moved deeper into the room, stopping at a distance that acknowledged his position without conceding mine. "Reaction wastes time," I said. He turned then. Slowly. His gaze assessed. Distance, posture, intent. Reading, not observing. "Public defiance," he said, "comes with consequences. Only when it lacks direction." A pause. Subtle. Controlled. He crossed to the desk, not to put something between us, but to take a position that anchored the room. "You studied the room," he said. "You chose your moment. I studied the outcome." That shifted something, small, precise. Enough. I didn't wait. "Your position is stable," I said. "Your timeline isn't." No softening. No hesitation. The air sharpened. "Continue. A test. You need continuity. Soon. A. Beat. And I need leverage." I kept my voice level. "I can give you an heir. Direct. Clean. In return, I take control of a division no one in your company is watching." His attention narrowed, not in rejection, in focus. "You're negotiating," he said, "as if you already know what holds value." "I know what will." No explanation. Certainty. "Which division?" he asked. Straight to structure. "Artificial intelligence," I said. "Underfunded. Underestimated. A breath. And currently led by people who don't understand its trajectory." Silence held. He knew the reports. 2 restructures, no traction, a line item executives tolerated and forgot. You're asking for control, he said, over a sector no one here has successfully developed. I'm asking for the one they misread. He watched me, weighing not the claim, but the confidence behind it. That division failed twice. Final test. I didn't look away. Because it was treated like a trend, I said. Not a system. The room stilled. He shifted a fraction, recalibrating. You're not asking for protection, he said. You're asking for power. Yes. No hesitation. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved, briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the city beyond the glass. In another context, it might have looked like distance. It wasn't. It was calculation. He had seen the curve years before the market learned its name. The early models. The erratic outputs. The promise buried under noise. He knew what it could become, had invested enough to prove it. But the division was stalled, trapped between vision and execution, between capital and patience. It would take time to mature into anything worthy of the capital behind it. Time he did not have. Not with a timeline that refused to negotiate. He had built an empire by outrunning collapse. This was the one horizon he might not reach. And he had already accepted that, until this Omega walked in and spoke as if time itself could be negotiated. 26. Decorated with credentials, yes. But credentials weren't experience. Not the kind that survived downturns. Not the kind that carried weight in a boardroom. He had seen too many like that, polished, agreeable, calculating in the shallow way that mistook proximity for leverage. They came for the same reasons every time. The name, the power, the inheritance that would outlive him. They spoke carefully, smiled appropriately, offered devotion where it was convenient, and expectation where it wasn't. He had grown used to it, bored of it, and, on occasion, quietly ruthless in ending it. If this one was the same, he would end it just as efficiently. But Soren hadn't asked for protection, hadn't offered loyalty, hadn't even pretended interest in anything he couldn't quantify. He had walked into the room and treated this like what it was, a negotiation. Value for value. No illusion. No attachment. That alone set him apart. Alaric's gaze returned to me, the assessment completing. You asked for neither, he said, voice lower now, edged with something sharper. Which makes you either very dangerous, a pause, measured, deliberate, or very precise. Both, I said. No hesitation. No correction. Just truth. Silence held for a fraction longer. Then broke, not with tension, but with decision. If you fail, he said, you don't get a second attempt. I didn't ask for one. Alignment. Close enough. A faint shift, approval, or something adjacent to it. Crossed his expression and disappeared just as quickly. Very well, he said. You'll have it. No flourish. No hesitation. Just a transfer of weight. Limited oversight. Full accountability. Acceptable. Expected. A brief pause. Then, with the faintest edge of something that might have been dry amusement, consider it a gift, he said. Or a liability. That depends on you. Fair. That was the only kind of agreement that mattered. And the heir, he asked. Direct. Always direct. Will not be delayed, I said. No embellishment. No implication beyond the agreement. That was sufficient. It had to be. Anything more would have been inefficient. The room settled again, but differently, defined, structured, real. I turned to leave, not dismissed, not dismissing, concluding. Soren. I paused. You speak, he said, as if you've already seen how this ends. A faint shift at the corner of my mouth. Not quite a smile. I've seen what happens when no one changes the variables, I said. A beat. Then, quieter, final. I don't intend to repeat that. Silence followed. Not empty. Decisive. I stepped out without looking back. In my last life, I married into power and lost everything. This time, I negotiated it. And this time, I intended to win. The corridor fell silent behind me as I walked away, and I didn't look back because there was nothing behind that door I needed to confirm. The deal was done, and the rest was execution. So I didn't slow down, because marriage came first. Not ceremony, not announcement, just a decision moved into place faster than anyone expected, contracts drafted, terms aligned, no room left for interference. And by the time the families began to react, it was already concluded. Soren Hale became Alaric, Ashford's spouse, not for love but for structure, and with that authority followed. But structure alone was never the full plan, because from the beginning there had always been one more variable, one that ensured permanence beyond contracts, beyond power, beyond anything that could be negotiated or taken away. An heir, not an emotional decision, not an afterthought, but a calculated anchor, something that would bind position, legacy, and control into a single irreversible outcome, and I had prepared for it the same way I prepared for everything else, not impulsively, not blindly, but with intention, with knowledge of timing, compatibility, and consequence, because this time nothing would be left to chance, not even something as personal as this. And with that, the AI division was handed over exactly as promised, fragmented, underfunded, dismissed by most as a failed experiment that had consumed too much capital and returned too little, reports inconsistent, leadership unstable, direction non-existent, which was exactly what I wanted, because it meant no one was watching closely. I stepped into the division without introduction, no speeches, no adjustments to appease expectations, reviewed the data once, and that was enough, because the problem wasn't the concept, it was the people, misaligned priorities, short-term thinking, a complete failure to understand trajectory. So I started with removal, cutting projects that produced noise, restructuring teams that existed without function, reallocating budgets with precision, no discussion, no delay, replacing activity with direction, and then I moved to the one variable that mattered. In my last life, there had been a man, not visible at first, not part of any major structure, but everything that came later, every breakthrough, every shift in the industry, had his fingerprints on it, a name that appeared too late to matter. Elias Voss, a genius. Unstable, difficult, impossible to retain, not because he lacked vision, but because he refused to work under anyone he didn't consider worth his time. And in that life, he was discovered after it was already too late. But this time I moved first. I didn't approach him directly because that would fail. Men like him didn't respond to offers. They responded to leverage. So I started with information. His work history fragmented, projects abandoned halfway through, conflicts with leadership, repeated patterns not of incompetence, but of disinterest, and then I found the inconsistency. He didn't leave when projects failed. He left when they were constrained. So control was the variable, not money, not recognition, autonomy. And I didn't contact him. I built something he would notice, a structure that removed interference, a system that prioritized direction over approval. And then I waited. Because he would come, they always did when the system finally made sense, and that was enough. For now, the next variable was simpler, Riven Ashford and Noel Hale. In my last life their alignment had taken time, careful positioning, gradual overlap. But this time I adjusted the timing, a shared event, a mutual interest, a sequence of interactions that individually meant nothing but together became inevitable. And I didn't intervene, didn't guide, I just removed the delays. Because they would do the rest themselves, they always had. And if they wanted each other that much, they could have it sooner. That left the final piece. My stepmother, who in my last life didn't attack directly but divided, using small suggestions, careful doubt, subtle shifts that turned trust into hesitation and hesitation into distance. My father never saw it clearly, not until it was too late, not until everything collapsed, and she had stood there calm and composed, admitting just enough to make it undeniable, not with words but with implication, with silence where denial should have been, because she hadn't just taken the company, she had taken everything that came before it, including my mother, and this time I didn't wait for the fracture. I addressed it first. I returned home without announcement, no conflict, no accusation, just presence. And my father looked up when I entered his office, surprise breaking through his control. "Soren," he said, "no disappointment yet. That came later in the last timeline, and I didn't give it time to form. I need access to the internal reports," I said, placing a file on his desk, directly. And there was a pause, suspicion flickering, which was good, because it meant the influence hadn't fully taken hold yet. "You've already stepped away from most operations," he said carefully. "I stepped away from interference," I corrected, "not responsibility." And silence followed, measured, before he asked, "Why now?" And the truth was simple. Because this was where everything started to collapse, because the numbers he trusted weren't real, because she was already inside his system. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet, because the data doesn't align, I said instead. And you haven't noticed. And that landed exactly where it needed to, because doubt didn't need to be forced. It just needed to be introduced. And he looked down at the file, then back at me, longer this time, evaluating, reconsidering, not convinced but no longer certain, which was enough for now, because outside everything was already moving exactly as I had said it. The division shifting, Elias Voss on his way, Riven already looking in the wrong direction, Noel exactly where he needed to be, and my stepmother about to lose control of a system she thought she understood, and the final variable, already set in motion, would ensure that even if everything else shifted, even if power changed hands again, there would be one thing no one could take, no one could rewrite, no one could erase. Because in my last life I had been removed piece by piece, but this time I secured what could not be removed, and I started early. The plan didn't slow down. It aligned itself, each step locking into place with quiet precision long before anyone else realized it had begun. At exactly 7 a.m., Soren sent the first message. "Good morning, honey. Did you sleep well?" The reply took longer than necessary. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then returned, as if the other side was reconsidering the appropriate response. "You just called me what?" Soren paused briefly, running through the logic before answering. "Is that not how couples usually address each other? If you dislike it, I can adjust." The delay that followed stretched just enough to register. "Then, keep it. Call me that, my love." Soren studied the screen for a second longer than needed before setting the phone aside. Noted. Accepted. No further adjustment required. Evidence came next, not as confrontation and certainly not as exposure, but as careful collection. The summary reports were polished, which made them unreliable by design, so Soren moved past them and into the structure beneath. Procurement chains revealed what financial summaries concealed, layered approvals, reclassified invoices, and delayed payments that resurfaced under different categories created small inconsistencies that meant nothing alone but everything together. It wasn't proof yet, but it was direction, and direction was sufficient. When his stepmother called at noon, her voice warm and measured, Soren didn't hesitate. "Come home for dinner tonight. I'll be there." The silence that followed was brief, but telling. "Good," she said, recovering quickly. "It's been a while." Dinner carried an undercurrent of expectation the moment he arrived. Noel sat across from him, posture relaxed, attention sharper than he allowed it to appear. Soren ignored it. "You've been busy," his stepmother said lightly. "We were starting to think you'd forgotten us." "I haven't," Soren replied, offering nothing more. After a brief pause, he set his utensils down and continued in the same calm tone. "There's an investment gala tonight. It's hosted by the Ashfords." Noel's hand stilled, almost imperceptibly. "I'll be attending," Soren added. "You should come with me." This time, the silence lingered long enough to expose the weight of the invitation. "That's unexpected," his stepmother said carefully. "It's practical," Soren replied. "He needs exposure." Noel looked up fully now, a flicker of something sharper passing through his expression before it settled into a faint smile. "I'd like that." Of course he would. In another life, he had never been allowed into rooms like that, never introduced, never acknowledged, and the resentment had grown quietly over time. He had watched Soren receive access and then, in his eyes, waste it by choosing a man whose future was already limited. This time, Soren opened the door for him. After dinner, Soren knocked on his father's study door. "Come in." Cedric Hale looked up, surprise flickering briefly before settling into something more guarded. "Soren." Soren stepped inside and placed a small box on the desk. "For your stomach. It should help." Cedric glanced down, then back up. "You remembered?" "I noticed." The simplicity of the answer shifted something subtle between them. "I reviewed some internal records," Soren continued. "There are inconsistencies." Cedric's expression sharpened immediately. "You're not involved in operations anymore." "I don't need to be," Soren replied calmly. "You just need to look past the summaries." The silence that followed was longer now, more deliberate. "Check the procurement records from last winter. The original files." He didn't accuse, he didn't explain. He pointed. Cedric held his gaze, uncertainty beginning to replace certainty. That was enough. When they arrived at the gala, the room was already in motion, brighter and louder than it appeared on the surface, filled with investors, executives, and people who understood that perception shaped value. Soren entered first, Noel following at a measured distance. Riven noticed immediately. His attention moved to Soren, then shifted, slowing when it landed on Noel. Interest formed quickly. Soren saw it, noted it, and moved. He guided Noel just close enough before introducing them with quiet efficiency. Riven Ashford. Noel Hale. Noel smiled, soft and composed. An honor. Riven returned the greeting, but his focus lingered longer than it should have. Soren stepped away without explanation, leaving the interaction to develop naturally. Noel didn't just want proximity. He wanted position, and Soren had placed him exactly where he needed to be to pursue it. Soren moved through the room until a subtle shift in atmosphere drew his attention. Conversations didn't stop when Alaric Ashford entered. They shifted, realigning around him with quiet inevitability. Soren approached without hesitation. "Good evening." Alaric's gaze settled on him immediately. "Good evening, my love." The title carried across the room, drawing attention, speculation, and quiet disbelief. Soren didn't react to the whispers. "You came. You're here," Alaric replied simply, as if that alone justified his presence. Across the room, Riven had gone still, his attention fixed entirely on them, on a proximity that should not have existed. He crossed the distance quickly, control tight but strained beneath the surface. "Uncle," he said, tone measured but edged. His gaze flicked towards Soren. "You should be careful. People talk." Alaric regarded him without urgency. "Then they should be accurate. We're getting married." Silence fell completely. "Soren is your uncle by marriage," he added. "Behave accordingly." The words landed with finality. Riven didn't respond immediately. Shock tightened his expression before he forced it down. Of course, because he had no choice. Noel chose that moment to step forward, attempting to re-enter the interaction. "Riven, not now," Riven snapped, irritation breaking through. Noel stepped back, dismissed but not discouraged. He was already recalibrating, already adjusting his approach. Soren didn't watch him. He didn't need to. The pattern was already in motion. The disruption came minutes later, subtle but dangerous. A high-value investment proposal tied to data infrastructure and long-term AI integration. The projections were strong, the presentation convincing, and the room was already leaning toward approval. Riven stepped forward to take control of the conversation, smoothing over surface inconsistencies with confidence. It should have been enough. In another timeline, it would have been. But the flaw wasn't in the numbers. It was in the structure beneath them. Soren stepped in, not interrupting, not opposing, but redirecting. "This model doesn't fail immediately," he said calmly, addressing the table rather than Riven. "It drains control over time." The room quieted, not because he raised his voice, but because the statement required attention. "You're not just investing capital," he continued. "You're giving up leverage over your own data architecture." A pause followed, heavier now. "And once that's gone, you won't get it back." Silence settled cleanly across the table. The deal shifted. Questions surfaced. Doubt replaced certainty. Only then did Soren glance briefly at Riven. Not acknowledgement, not assistance, just alignment of fact. Riven stared at him, something unfamiliar surfacing beneath the surface. He hadn't been corrected. He had been outmaneuvered. And yet, in his mind, the conclusion formed quickly because it was the only one that made sense to him. Soren had stepped in for him. Soren had protected his position. The realization settled into something far more dangerous than irritation. He wasn't supposed to stand there. Not like that. Not with his uncle. But he did. And for the first time, Riven Ashford wasn't certain he understood him anymore. Outside, the air was cooler, quieter. "You handled that efficiently," Alaric said. "The system was flawed." "I corrected it," Soren replied. A faint trace of approval flickered across Alaric's expression before it disappeared. When they returned, Noel was watching again, his attention shifting between the two men before settling back on Riven. Alaric might have been extraordinary, but Riven was still the more immediate opportunity. As the night came to a close, the balance had already shifted. Soren didn't wait for outcomes anymore. He shaped them, and for the first time, the result wasn't uncertain. It had already been decided. The invitation arrived late in the afternoon, direct and precise, exactly the way Alaric Ashford did everything. "Dinner. Tonight. 7:30. I'll pick you up. Alaric." Soren read it once, then replied without delay. Confirmed. I will be ready. When the car stopped outside, it wasn't just a car, it was presence. The kind that didn't announce itself loudly, yet made the entire street feel quieter by comparison. Soren was already waiting. Alaric stepped out, and the space around him seemed to reorganize itself instinctively, as if everything understood where the center of gravity had shifted. His gaze settled on Soren, calm, assessing, and entirely in control. You're punctual, he said. Efficiency reduces error, Soren replied. A faint, almost imperceptible shift touched Alaric's expression, something that could have been approval or recognition. Dinner was arranged in a private room where interruptions were not permitted, and more importantly, not attempted. No one approached without invitation. No one lingered without purpose. Alaric didn't waste time. We'll formalize the timeline, he said once they were seated. 3 weeks. Legal procedures will be completed within 10 days. The rest is optics. Soren nodded. That aligns with my schedule. Good. His tone was even, but the authority behind it left no room for negotiation. Your appointment will be announced alongside the engagement. Interim Strategic Director of the Emerging Intelligence Division. He paused, not because he needed to, but because he chose to observe. It's a small unit. Underperforming. Most of the board considers it expendable. Soren didn't react. They're miscalculating. Alaric held his gaze for a moment longer. Most people think it's small, he said quietly. They don't understand what it will become. There was no need to elaborate. The weight of the statement was enough. That's why you're taking it. Then I'll make sure they understand, Soren replied. The food arrived, but neither of them shifted focus. You'll have authority over restructuring, recruitment, and capital allocation, Alaric continued. Final approvals remain with me. That's sufficient. I expect results. You'll have them. There was no contract on the table, no signatures required in that moment, yet the agreement felt more binding than anything written. Once the terms were set, the conversation shifted, not abruptly, but inevitably. What do you actually enjoy? Alaric asked, the question unexpected but deliberate. Soren considered it. Systems that work. Predictable outcomes. Alaric watched him, expression unreadable. That's not enjoyment. That's control. They overlap. This time, Alaric exhaled something closer to amusement. You'll need something beyond that eventually. I'll account for it when it becomes relevant. The rest of the evening moved with the same controlled rhythm. Soren observed habits, preferences, tolerances. Alaric observed him in return, not openly, not obviously, but thoroughly. When dinner ended, Alaric drove him back himself. The city moved around them, but nothing interrupted the silence inside the car. When it stopped, neither of them moved immediately. 3 weeks, Alaric said. 3 weeks, Soren confirmed. The pause that followed didn't belong to negotiation anymore. Alaric leaned in, closing the distance with quiet certainty, and kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't a question. It was a decision. Soren stilled for a brief moment, recalibrating, not emotionally, but logically. Then he reached out, caught the front of Alaric's coat, and returned the kiss with the same measured precision. When they separated, Alaric's gaze lingered slightly longer than before. You adapt quickly. I don't waste time adjusting to reality. That time, the faint curve at the corner of Alaric's mouth was unmistakable. Good night, my love. Good night. The next morning, the announcement moved exactly as expected. Engagement confirmed. Appointment established. Soren Hale, Interim Strategic Director of Ashford Emerging Intelligence Division. Within Ashford, reactions were controlled. Outside, they were not. And in one particular room, he chose him. Riven's voice was sharp enough to cut through restraint. The report lay open in front of him, the details impossible to ignore. His expression darkened, then shifted as he read further. And this is what he gets. A humorless laugh followed. A failing division no one cares about. The tension in his posture eased slightly as he leaned back. So that's how it is. His uncle hadn't rejected Soren. He had contained him, reduced him to something manageable. Fine, Riven said. Let him have it. His gaze hardened. When I take over, I'll show him exactly what that choice was worth. But the thought didn't settle. Because beneath it, something sharper remained. He didn't lose Soren. He was replaced. Across the room, Noel watched, adjusting instantly. He moved closer, voice soft, calculated. You shouldn't let it bother you. Riven glanced at him, irritation fading just enough to allow distraction. Noel didn't push. He didn't need to. You deserve better, he added. That was enough. Riven's expression shifted, tension dissolving into something easier. He pulled Noel closer without much thought. You're not wrong. Noel leaned in, exactly as expected, but his focus remained sharp. He didn't care who Riven had wanted before. He only cared that, eventually, Riven would choose him. And Riven, for all his control, had never been good at refusing what came easily. And yet, somewhere beneath that ease, something remained unsettled. Soren, standing beside Alaric. Untouchable. Out of reach. He exhaled slowly. It didn't matter. It shouldn't matter. But the fact that it did was the problem. The announcement had barely settled before Soren moved. He didn't wait for the division to stabilize on its own. He restructured it before anyone could interfere. The first 72 hours erased most of what had existed. Titles disappeared. Teams dissolved. Projects that couldn't justify their existence were cut without discussion. What remained wasn't impressive on paper, but it was functional, and that was all Soren required. He didn't build around reputation. He built around potential. Recruitment didn't follow the usual channels. Soren didn't wait for recommendations or approvals. He already knew who he was looking for. In another timeline, these people would take years to surface, dismissed early, overlooked repeatedly, only to prove everyone wrong much later. Here, they were still unknown, still reachable. He approached them one by one, not with promises, but with clarity. What they would build. How far. They could go without restriction. Why this time would be different. Most accepted. Not because of Ashford's name, but because, for the first time, someone treated their ideas as something worth pursuing rather than something to be corrected. Within days, the division began to change. Not visibly, not enough to draw attention, but structurally, it was no longer the same. Only one variable remained unresolved. Elias Voss. Even before his name carried weight, his pattern was already defined. Brilliant. Uncooperative. Rejected not for lack of vision, but because his ideas demanded more than most investors were willing to give. He didn't compromise. He didn't adjust. And more importantly, he didn't respect authority he didn't believe in. That was the barrier. It was also the entry point. Soren didn't approach him directly. That would have been inefficient. Instead, he built something that would force a response. A system within the division's internal network, functional, but intentionally incomplete. The flaw wasn't obvious. It wasn't something a standard engineer would notice. But for someone like Elias, it would be unbearable. The system went live quietly. No announcement. No visibility beyond what was necessary. 2 days later, the intrusion came. It wasn't subtle. Code segments rewritten. Structural layers adjusted exactly where the system failed. No permission requested. No trace of hesitation. Soren reviewed the changes without expression, then responded with the same precision. You corrected it inefficiently. There was no introduction. No context. The reply came almost instantly. Your system was inefficient to begin with. Soren didn't argue. Then build a better one. This time, the pause was longer. Not hesitation. Consideration. When the reply came, it was different. Who are you? Soren didn't answer the question directly. Someone who understands what you're trying to build. Silence followed. Longer now. Then, you're not the one in charge. It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal. Soren read it once, then replied without hesitation. No. A beat. Not yet. The response didn't come immediately this time. When it did, it carried something colder. Then don't waste my time. The connection cut. Clean. Final. Soren closed the window without reaction. It wasn't rejection. It was calibration. Elias Voss didn't respond to access. He responded to equivalence. And right now, Soren didn't meet that threshold. That was fine. He didn't need to. Not yet. Outside the division, the narrative remained exactly where Soren needed it. Riven had already decided what this meant. A minor division, he said one evening, the report open in front of him, tone dismissive but edged. Barely worth mentioning. Noel leaned slightly closer, listening rather than interrupting. He's trying to prove something, Riven continued. It won't matter. His gaze lingered on the appointment details for a second longer than necessary before he looked away. Noel noticed. Of course he did. Not everything needs to matter to everyone, Noel said softly. Some people just work harder for less. Riven let out a short breath, something between agreement and disinterest. That's his problem. Noel didn't argue. He adjusted. He always did. He leaned just enough to close the distance, voice lowering, shifting the focus back where it was easiest to hold. Then you shouldn't waste your attention on it. That worked. It always did. Riven's posture relaxed slightly, the tension easing into something more familiar. He reached for Noel without much thought, attention redirecting exactly where Noel wanted it. Easy, predictable, controlled. And yet, beneath that control, something remained unsettled. Because no matter how he framed it, one detail refused to align. Soren hadn't been pushed aside. He had stepped away. And for reasons Riven couldn't explain, he hadn't looked back. Inside the division, Soren didn't revisit the failed contact. He didn't chase. He adjusted the system again, refining the structure, correcting inefficiencies Elias had pointed out, not to prove anything, but to make the next interaction unavoidable. Elias would come back, not because Soren asked, because the system would demand it. And when he did, this time, Soren wouldn't be dismissed as someone beneath his notice. This time, he would meet him on equal ground. Preparation for the wedding moved with the same quiet dominance that defined everything Alaric Ashford touched. Nothing was rushed, yet nothing was delayed. Every detail arrived exactly when it was supposed to, as if the entire structure of the event had been decided long before anyone else was informed. What surprised Soren wasn't the scale, it was the precision. This wasn't a marriage being arranged. It was a position being established, reinforced from every direction so that no external variable could destabilize it. And within that structure, something else took shape. A pattern neither of them named, yet both followed without question. Weekends. They met every weekend. Not for appearances, not because it was required, but because neither of them canceled. Dinner extended longer than necessary. Conversations moved past logistics into something quieter, more deliberate. They didn't speak about feelings. They didn't need to. They learned each other instead. Habits, timing, tolerance, silence. The first time Alaric pulled him closer without explanation, Soren registered it as a change in pattern, not a disruption. The second time, he didn't analyze it at all. By the third week, the distance between them no longer needed to be measured. A hand resting at his waist lingered a fraction longer than before. A pause between sentences carried weight instead of absence. A kiss was no longer an action justified by logic. It simply happened, and neither of them questioned it afterward. Soren adapted quickly, as he always did. But this time, the adjustment wasn't entirely strategic. This time, he didn't brace himself. The question about Alaric's condition surfaced on a night that felt no different from the others, which was precisely why it mattered. Your condition, Soren said, tone steady. I need to understand it. Alaric didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, but because he was deciding how much to give. You've already been told enough, he said. Not precisely. That was true. What Soren knew came from fragments, unverified reports, careful omissions, conversations that avoided the center of the issue. It wasn't enough to plan around, and Soren didn't operate on incomplete variables. Alaric watched him for a moment longer, then spoke, his voice even, controlled. It's related to the pheromone gland. Mine produces at a level that exceeds stability. Soren didn't interrupt. Externally, it changes nothing, Alaric continued. Internally, it doesn't stop. The pressure accumulates. It damages the gland over time. A pause followed, quiet but absolute. And when it fails? Soren asked. Alaric's gaze returned to him, steady, unflinching. It won't be gradual. That was all he said, but it was enough. Soren processed it immediately. Not a condition to manage, something that would eventually break. A system that could not regulate itself. A countdown. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't step back. Then we proceed accordingly, he said. Calm. Certain. No hesitation. Something shifted in Alaric's expression then, subtle but unmistakable, not because of the answer itself, but because of what it lacked. No pity. No fear. Just alignment. After that, their conversations deepened without changing tone. Soren began to bring his work into those evenings, not as reports, but as problems. If you were scaling something no one takes seriously yet, he asked once, where would you begin? Alaric didn't answer directly. What are you protecting? Control. Then you don't scale it, Alaric said. You isolate it until no one else can replace it. Soren didn't ask for clarification. He didn't need to. Another time. What's the fastest way to remove internal resistance? You don't remove it, Alaric replied. You make it irrelevant. The answers were brief, almost minimal. But Soren didn't use them as given. He extended them, refined them, turned them into decisions that felt inevitable once implemented. Alaric noticed, not the questions, but the results that followed them. By the time the wedding arrived, the pattern between them had stabilized into something neither of them needed to define. It wasn't built on emotion. It didn't rely on it. But it worked, with a precision that made everything else unnecessary. The ceremony unfolded exactly as expected. Impeccable. Controlled. Every detail aligned with the weight of the Ashford name. Conversations didn't dominate the room, presence did. Every eye followed Alaric, and by extension, Soren. Not as an afterthought, but as a shift. A replacement. A confirmation. This was no longer an arrangement people questioned. It was a position they acknowledged. The vows were spoken without hesitation. The signatures finalized without delay. And just like that, it was done. The reception passed smoothly, without disruption, without incident. When it ended, nothing remained unresolved. The door to the bedroom closed softly behind him. Soren paused just inside, his hand resting against the handle for a fraction longer than necessary. For a moment, the past didn't stay where it belonged. Another room, another night, the same expectation, the same position, but a completely different outcome. Laughter that didn't belong to him. A presence that shouldn't have been there. Humiliation delivered with intent. Soren closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. This was not that night. This was not that man. He stepped forward. Alaric was already there. Waiting. Not impatient. Not distant. Just present. Soren stopped a short distance away, steadying himself once, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Of what this moment required. Of what it meant. In another life, this had been something taken from him. This time, he chose it. We're married, Soren said, not questioning, not confirming, just stating what was now undeniable. We are, Alaric replied. Silence settled between them, not empty, but complete. Soren stepped closer. I'll fulfill the agreement, he said quietly. An heir. And loyalty. No hesitation. No condition. Just certainty. Alaric looked at him for a long moment. Something unreadable shifting beneath the surface before it settled. You're not a contract to me, he said quietly. The words didn't disrupt anything. They aligned it. Soren didn't respond immediately. Not because he disagreed, but because it wasn't something he had accounted for. Then he closed the distance completely. This time, nothing was taken from him. He chose it. And this time, he wouldn't lose everything. He would take it instead. The door closed behind them, sealing off the last of the noise, the expectations, the eyes that had followed them all day. For the first time since the ceremony, there was nothing left but the two of them, and the weight of what had already been decided. Soren paused for a brief moment, fingers resting lightly against the door, the ghost of another memory threatening to surface. Another night, another version of himself standing in the same place, waiting for something that had never belonged to him. This time, he didn't wait. He turned, stepped forward first. Alaric watched him approach, something unreadable flickering briefly in his gaze before settling back into control. You're early, Alaric said quietly. Efficiency reduces delay, Soren replied, already closing the distance. This time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation to analyze, no pause to calculate whether this was expected or required. It simply happened, and Soren responded just as naturally. His hand came up, catching lightly at Alaric's collar, steady but deliberate. Alaric stilled for half a second, just enough to notice the shift. You're more enthusiastic than you look, he murmured against Soren's lips. Soren didn't pull back. I've done some research. That earned him the faintest hint of amusement. Research? Alaric echoed. On what? Soren answered without a trace of embarrassment. On how to ensure a successful conception of an heir. There was a brief pause. Then, Alaric let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. I see. His hand tightened slightly at Soren's waist, pulling him closer. Unfortunately, theory and practice are usually quite different. Soren tilted his head just slightly, considering that. Then I'll adjust. You will, Alaric agreed calmly. But not like this. And just like that, the control shifted. Not abruptly, not forcefully, but undeniably. Where Soren had moved first, Alaric took over with the same quiet certainty he applied to everything else, guiding, correcting, refining, until the balance between them settled into something far more natural than either of them had expected. There was no rush, no awkwardness, only a gradual loss of distance, replaced by something warmer, steadier, more grounded than anything Soren had ever known in that space. This time, he wasn't bracing himself. This time, nothing was taken from him. He chose it. Elsewhere, the night had taken a different turn entirely. Riven didn't leave. He stayed long after the celebration ended, glass after glass until the edges blurred, but not enough to erase what mattered. Not enough to forget. The image stayed. Soren, standing beside his uncle. Composed. Untouchable. Chosen. The word twisted deeper than it should have. "You've had enough," Noel said softly, stepping closer, taking the glass from his hand. Riven didn't resist. Didn't even look at him properly. "Then give me something better to focus on," he muttered. Noel didn't hesitate. He moved closer, offering exactly what Riven wanted, attention without resistance, presence without demand. Easy. Predictable. And that was why it worked. Riven pulled him closer without thinking, letting instinct take over where logic had failed him. But even as everything unfolded the way it always did, something still didn't sit right. And when the moment slipped, when control blurred just enough, he said it. "Soren." Not Noel. "Soren." The air stilled for a fraction of a second. Noel didn't react immediately, didn't pull away, but something inside him went cold. He wasn't competing with a memory. He was competing with someone Riven couldn't let go of. And that made Soren a problem Noel would eventually deal with. Back in the room, the quiet had returned, but it felt different now. Softer, steadier. Soren lay still for a moment, breathing even, his mind clear in a way he hadn't expected. No regret, no discomfort, just certainty. Beside him, Alaric shifted slightly, then pulled Soren closer without asking, his arms settling around him with a natural ease that hadn't been there before. "Satisfied?" Alaric asked quietly. Soren didn't hesitate. He nodded. "Yes." Then, after a brief pause, he added, completely serious, "You seem highly experienced." Alaric's expression shifted slightly. "That was my first time." Soren turned his head, clearly processing that. "Then why were you so proficient?" A faint pause. Then, "People tend to call me a genius." Soren stared at him for a second longer than necessary, then accepted the answer with a small nod. "That is consistent." Alaric exhaled quietly, something softer in the sound this time. "And I suppose there's another factor." "What factor?" Soren asked. Alaric's gaze settled on him, steadier now. "Instinct." "What kind of instinct?" Soren pressed. Alaric didn't look away. "The instinct to make my Omega satisfied." The words landed differently, not because of what they meant, but because of how he said them. Not possession, not control, recognition. Soren stilled for just a moment. Then, unexpectedly, heat rose to his face. Not embarrassment, something quieter, deeper, because for the first time, he wasn't being tolerated. He wasn't being used. He wasn't being ignored. He was being acknowledged, claimed, not as property, but as something valued. Soren didn't respond right away. He simply leaned closer, resting against him without overthinking it. This time, he didn't brace himself. This time, he didn't expect to be left behind. A few moments later, Alaric's expression shifted again, subtle but immediate. The tension that had always existed beneath his control, the one constant he had learned to ignore, was reduced. Not gone, but different, weaker. He frowned slightly, analyzing it in real time. That wasn't supposed to happen. His arm tightened slightly around Soren. "Stay," he said quietly. Soren didn't move. "I am." Alaric reached for his phone with his free hand, his tone already returning to command. "Get the doctor here. Now." There was no urgency in his voice. There didn't need to be, because whatever had changed, he wasn't going to ignore it, and he wasn't going to let it go. Morning came with results neither of them could ignore. The doctor didn't take long this time. Data spoke faster than assumptions. "Your pheromone levels have stabilized," he said, voice lower than usual. Not normal stability, but controlled. A brief pause. This shouldn't be happening. Silence settled. Not shock, calculation. Progression? Alaric asked. Slowed. Significantly. That was enough. Cause and effect didn't need to be explained. Alaric's gaze shifted to Soren, sharp, deliberate. No words. None needed. Daily. Monitoring, Alaric said. No gaps. Yes, sir. When the doctor left, the room felt different. Not lighter. Just changed. We treat this as a variable, Soren said. Not a solution. Agreed. But Alaric didn't look away this time. Elias didn't return immediately. He observed. The system had changed again. Cleaner. Tighter. Intentional. Not perfect, but evolving. That was what caught him. Not competence. Direction. His message came without warning. You adjusted it. You expected me not to? Most people wouldn't know how. Soren didn't respond. Elias continued. You're not useless. A pause. Then meet me. Soren closed the message. Decision made. He returned late. Alaric was already there. Not waiting. Not idle. Just present. You're late, Alaric said. Too calm. I had a meeting. With Elias Voss. Yes. A beat. Then Alaric stepped closer. Slow. Controlled. Dangerous in its quiet. You've been prioritizing him. Not accusation. Observation. He's necessary, Soren said. So am I. That landed. Not loud, but heavy. Soren didn't step back. You're not comparable. Explain. He's a resource. A pause. You're my husband. Silence. Then Alaric's hand came to his waist, pulling him in fully this time. Not rough. Not optional. Then act like it, he said, voice lower now. Soren held his gaze. Didn't resist. Didn't yield. Just stayed. That was enough to shift everything. Alaric kissed him, this time with intent. Not measured. Not distant. Clear. Claiming. Soren stilled for half a second, then answered just as directly, fingers catching at Alaric's collar, holding him there instead of pulling away. The balance didn't break. It tightened. When the kiss ended, Alaric didn't let go. You've been busy, he said quietly. Temporarily, Soren replied. A pause. Then Alaric's thumb brushed lightly along Soren's jaw, slow enough to linger. I don't like sharing your attention. There it was. Not loud, but real. Soren didn't deflect. He leaned into the touch just slightly, intentional. I'll correct that. Another pause. Then Alaric exhaled quietly, tension settling. Not gone, just contained. His grip loosened, but didn't leave. Elsewhere, Riven wasn't sober enough to lie to himself, but not drunk enough to forget. Noel stayed close. Easy. Familiar. Available. Riven pulled him in without thinking. Instinct over control. And then, Soren. The name slipped out. Not Noel's. Soren's. The air froze. Noel didn't stop. Didn't react. But something inside him turned cold. Riven heard it too. And for a second, he knew exactly what it meant. That was enough. Noel didn't show it. Not yet. But the conclusion settled quietly. If Soren remained in the way, he wouldn't stay untouched for long. Back in the room, Soren didn't revisit the conversation. He didn't need to. One path was power. The other, something new. This time he wouldn't choose. He would take everything. The place Elias chose didn't match his reputation. No polished offices, no glass towers. Just a dim, cluttered workspace filled with tangled cables and half-running systems humming like something alive. And yet Soren stepped in without hesitation, as if he belonged in any environment he chose to enter, while Elias didn't stand, didn't greet, didn't even look up immediately, only spoke with flat disinterest. You're late. And Soren answered just as evenly. I'm not. And that alone was enough. To interrupt Elias's rhythm for a fraction of a second before he finally looked up, eyes sharp, assessing, unimpressed. You don't look like someone worth my time. But Soren didn't react, didn't waste breath, only placed a tablet on the table between them. Then don't waste it. An irritation flickered across Elias's face as he glanced down, but that expression didn't last, because within seconds it shifted into focus, then into something deeper, something intent, as lines of code unfolded. Under his fingers and structures revealed themselves, familiar yet altered, refined, dangerous in a way that wasn't obvious at first glance. Until suddenly it was a flaw, not small, not hidden, but catastrophic. If this scales, it collapses, Elias said slowly, and Soren didn't deny it, didn't defend it, simply answered, I know. And that was the moment everything changed, because Elias stopped completely, not typing, not analyzing, just looking at him for the first time without dismissal. You left it there, Not a question, and Soren met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, and a beat passed, tension tightening. Why? Elias asked, quieter now, and Soren didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't about code, it was about intent. I was waiting to see if you'd find it, he said calmly, and the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, because this wasn't arrogance, it wasn't luck, it was control. And Elias leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing, something like recognition flickering beneath his usual indifference. Most people would try to hide it. Most people don't understand what it means, Soren replied, and silence followed, heavier this time, until Elias exhaled softly, almost amused, almost impressed. You're either very confident or very dangerous. And Soren didn't correct him, because both were true, and outside the glass partition, someone else had already reached the same conclusion. Alaric Ashford stood there, unmoving, watching, his presence alone enough to shift the gravity of the entire space. And he had seen enough, more than enough, because that flaw was intentional and Elias's reaction couldn't be bought or forced. And when Alaric's gaze settled on Soren, it lingered, slower, deeper, no longer evaluating but acknowledging, a faint shift at the corner of his mouth as he spoke quietly. Impressive, not to Elias, but to Soren, his wife, and this time there was no distance in it, only quiet pride, and without breaking that moment, his hand came to rest. Briefly at Soren's back, subtle, natural, unmistakably his, before Elias straightened fully, attention locked now, no longer dismissive. Fine, he said, short and decisive. I'll work with you. A pause, then, almost reluctantly, for now. And Soren nodded once, because that was enough. But outside, in the shadowed corridor, something else had already begun to fracture. Riven hadn't meant to come, hadn't planned to see any of this, and yet he was there, watching, unable to look away, because something about it felt wrong, not unfamiliar, just misplaced, like reality itself had shifted without permission. And when his gaze landed on Soren, standing calm, untouchable, beyond his reach, something twisted sharply in his chest, because that wasn't the Soren he knew, not the one in his dreams, those fragmented, persistent dreams that had been getting clearer, sharper, more vivid. Soren soft, obedient, standing beside him, looking at him like he mattered, like he was chosen, like everything belonged exactly where it should be. And when Riven woke from those dreams lately, he felt it, that lingering certainty that what he had seen was not fantasy, but something closer to truth, something that should have been real, something that had been taken or rewritten. And now, standing here, watching Soren beside Alaric instead of him, that certainty turned into something darker, more volatile, because this version of reality didn't match what he felt was right, didn't match what his instincts insisted should exist, and it made something inside him snap, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to make his jaw tighten, his hands curl slightly at his sides, because he couldn't control it. Couldn't control Soren. Couldn't even control the way his own attention kept returning to him. And when Noel's voice came from beside him, soft, careful, "Are you all right?" It barely registered, because for the first time, Riven wasn't looking at Noel at all. "You said he didn't matter," Noel added quietly. And that was the mistake, because Riven turned sharply, his expression colder than before, sharper, stripped of the easy indulgence Noel was used to. "I didn't ask you to talk," he said, and this time there was no softening, no distraction, no reaching back for what was easy, because his focus had already shifted completely, and Noel felt it, understood it instantly, that something had changed, that he was no longer the center of Riven's attention, and that was something he had never allowed before, something he would not allow to continue. While inside, the deal had already been made, calm, controlled, inevitable, and outside, something far more dangerous had just begun. The division didn't explode into success overnight, and Soren never intended it to. He built it quietly, precisely, like assembling a machine that would only reveal its power when every part was in place. Selecting people no one else noticed, giving them direction they had never received, cutting hesitation before it could form. And within weeks the team no longer felt like scattered talent, but something cohesive, sharp, dangerous in its potential. And at the center of it, Elias Voss remained unpredictable, but different around Soren, less dismissive, more engaged, not respectful in any conventional sense, but attentive in a way he wasn't with anyone else, challenging Soren without hostility, staying longer than necessary, fixing what didn't need to be fixed just to see how Soren would respond, and Soren didn't indulge him, didn't entertain ego, only adjusted, guided, refined, turning chaos into direction, and from a distance, Alaric watched it all without interfering, observing the way Soren moved, the way every decision aligned, not perfectly, but intentionally, and that was what mattered, because nothing Soren did felt accidental. Everything led somewhere, and Alaric recognized it. More than that, he approved of it, though he said little, only occasionally offering a comment, a question, a single line that sharpened Soren's approach further, and the space between them, outside of work, continued to shift, quieter, more natural, a hand resting longer than needed, a glance that lingered, a kiss that no longer needed reason, and they didn't hide it, didn't perform it, which was exactly why it stood out, especially to someone who shouldn't have been there at all. Riven had seen it more than once now, the way Soren stood beside Alaric, the way Alaric's presence curved subtly toward him, protective without being obvious, claiming without needing to say it, and each time, something inside Riven twisted tighter, because that wasn't how it was supposed to be, not according to the fragments in his mind, the dreams that refused to fade, Soren standing behind him, beside him, looking at him like he was everything, like he owned that place, that position, that person, and waking up to reality. This reality felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain, like something had been taken, rewritten, stolen, and he couldn't fix it, couldn't control it, and that loss of control bled into everything else, into the way he drank more, spoke less, snapped faster, until one night, it tipped too far. The alcohol didn't blur Soren out. It sharpened him, made the image clearer, more unbearable, and before he could stop himself, he was already moving, already standing in front of Soren, blocking his path, breath unsteady, eyes darker than they should have been. "You," Riven said, voice low, rough, "you were mine." Soren didn't step back, didn't even look surprised, only met his gaze. Calmly, "You're mistaken." And that, more than anything, snapped something inside Riven, because that tone, that distance, that lack of reaction, it erased him completely, and he couldn't accept that, not when everything inside him screamed otherwise. His hand shot out, grabbing Soren's arm, grip tightening, force replacing reason. "Don't pretend you don't remember," he said, voice rising. "You don't get to just walk away." And Soren didn't struggle, didn't panic, only looked at him with the same cold clarity. "Let go," he said, and when Riven didn't, when his grip tightened further, something else entered the space, not loudly, not abruptly, but decisively. Alaric didn't raise his voice, didn't rush, but the moment he stepped in, the air changed. His hand closed around Riven's wrist, not forceful at first, just enough to stop him. And then, one sharp movement, clean, controlled, and Riven staggered back from the impact, the sound of the hit echoing just enough to silence everything else. He didn't even have time to react before the pressure hit him. Invisible, suffocating, Alaric's pheromones flooded the space without restraint, heavy, overwhelming, crushing down with a precision that left no room to resist. Riven's knees buckled before he could stop them, his breath catching as the pressure forced him down, not violently, but completely. "Apologize," Alaric said, voice quiet, controlled, but absolute. Riven clenched his jaw, fighting it, fighting the instinct, the command, but it was useless. The gap between them wasn't something he could overcome. Not here, not like this, and slowly, painfully, he lowered his head. "Sorry." The word forced out between clenched teeth, and Alaric didn't move, didn't ease the pressure immediately. To him, he added, and Riven's head lifted just enough, his gaze locking on his Soren, something raw and furious flickering beneath the forced submission. "I'm sorry," he said again, and only then did the pressure ease, just enough for him to breathe again. "This is the last time," Alaric continued. "You approach him like that." A pause, colder now. "Or you lose more than your pride." The implication was clear: inheritance, position, everything. And Riven understood, even if he hated it. And Alaric didn't wait for a response. His attention had already shifted back to Soren, his hand resting briefly at his back, steady, grounding, before guiding him away, not asking, not hesitating. And once they were alone, the tension shifted, not gone, but contained. "There are too many people watching you," Alaric said quietly, his gaze still sharp. "Too many who want something they shouldn't have." Soren stepped closer without being pulled this time, his hand resting lightly against Alaric's chest, steady, deliberate. "They can want," he said. "It doesn't change anything." And then he leaned in, kissing him, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, grounding him in something real, something that didn't need to be questioned. And when he pulled back, his voice was softer, but no less sure. "I belong to you." And something in Alaric's expression shifted again, deeper this time. "And I to you," he said quietly. "I'm your husband. You don't face." This alone, his hand came up, brushing lightly along Soren's jaw before resting there. Firm, reassuring. And for a moment, nothing else mattered, until Soren's phone rang. The interruption sharp against the quiet, he answered without stepping away. "Father." And the voice on the other end didn't waste time. Tension evident even through the line. "The accounts," he said. "You were right. Something's wrong. Funds are missing. More than we expected." A pause, heavier now. "If this continues, we won't recover." Soren's expression didn't change, but something colder settled beneath it. "Have you confirmed the source?" "Not yet," his father admitted. "But I need your input." That alone was new. Trust where there hadn't been before, and Soren didn't hesitate. "Check internal approvals over the last quarter," he said calmly, "specifically those that bypassed your direct review." A pause, then, quieter. "And look at who recommended them." Silence followed on the other end. Then realization, sharp and immediate. "You think." "I know," Soren cut in, voice steady. "But don't confront anyone yet." His gaze shifted briefly to Alaric, then back. "I'll handle it." When the call ended, the room fell quiet again. But this time it carried something sharper, more focused. "Your stepmother," Alaric said, not asking. Soren nodded once. "She's been preparing this for a long time." His voice remained calm, but his eyes didn't. "I've been collecting evidence." A brief pause. "Colder now. She'll pay for it." Alaric didn't question it, didn't slow him down. "Tell me what you need," he said instead, and Soren met his gaze. Completely certain, "Your name." And that was enough, because in their world, that meant power, protection, and permission all at once. Alaric nodded once, agreement sealed without hesitation, and somewhere else, far less controlled, Noel wasn't calm anymore. Not after what he had seen, not after the way Riven had reacted, the way his attention had shifted completely, the way Soren stood untouched in the middle of everything, untouchable, unreachable, and for the first time, Noel felt something he didn't know how to contain, not irritation, not frustration, something sharper, uglier, something that burned, because no matter what he did, no matter how close he got, he was still second, and he couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept that, because if Soren remained where he was, Noel would never have what he wanted, and that was something he was already preparing to change. The change didn't happen all at once, and that was precisely why it couldn't be ignored. Each report came back with the same subtle deviation, small enough to dismiss if seen once, but impossible to deny when repeated. Alaric's condition, stabilizing, not reversing, but improving in increments that should not exist, and the doctor, who had spent years watching the slow, inevitable decline, now stood in front of the data in silence before finally speaking. "This pattern is consistent." His voice lower than usual, more cautious, too consistent to be coincidence. Alaric didn't respond immediately, his gaze already shifting towards Soren, who stood beside him, calm, as if the conclusion had been expected. "Explain," Alaric said, and the doctor hesitated, not because he lacked knowledge, but because the answer was unusual. "We ran compatibility markers," he said finally. "Pheromone, resonance, gland response, hormonal synchronization." A brief pause. Then, carefully, "Your compatibility is exceptionally high." He glanced at Soren, then back at Alaric. "Cases like this are extremely rare, almost non-existent in recorded data." Silence settled, heavier now, because both men understood the implication without needing further explanation. Continue, Alaric said, and the doctor nodded, flipping through the results. During the scan, we also detected something else, another. Pause. This one sharper, more deliberate. Mr. Soren. He corrected himself immediately. Soren, you should take a look. Soren stepped forward without hesitation, his eyes scanning the data, processing it in seconds, then stilling. Not in confusion, but in recognition. Say it. Alaric said, his tone unchanged but sharper beneath the surface, and the doctor did. He's pregnant. The words landed clean, without embellishment, without dramatics, but the weight behind them shifted the entire room. Soren didn't react immediately, not outwardly, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the console, grounding, processing, recalibrating, while Alaric's gaze locked onto him, not questioning, not doubting, only measuring the reality in front of him. And for the first time, something unfamiliar surfaced beneath his control, not uncertainty, but something deeper, something that tightened instinctively, protective, possessive. Real? Is it stable? Alaric asked, and the doctor nodded quickly. Yes, everything is normal, better than expected. In fact, he hesitated again, then added, your compatibility is likely a contributing factor. Another silence, but this one different, not tense, not uncertain, just shifting, because what had started as a calculated arrangement had now become something neither of them had planned, but neither of them rejected. Soren straightened, his expression steady again, composed. We proceed as planned, he said, and Alaric didn't argue, didn't question, only stepped closer, his hand coming to rest briefly at Soren's back, grounding, anchoring, a silent acknowledgement that this, whatever it was not something he would allow to be threatened in form. No one, Alaric said, his voice returning fully to control. Not yet. The doctor nodded immediately, understanding the weight of that order, and when he left, the room fell quiet. But the silence between them was no longer the same. Alaric's gaze lingered on Soren a moment longer than usual. You're carrying my child, he said, not as a question, not as disbelief, but as confirmation. And Soren met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, no fear, no uncertainty, only certainty, and something in. Alaric's expression settled completely, decision made, line drawn. Then everything changes, he said quietly. And this time, Soren didn't disagree, because outside of that room, another plan was already moving into place, one that had been prepared long before this moment. The investigation into his family's company didn't stop at numbers, didn't end with missing funds. It led somewhere deeper, darker, older. Soren had followed every thread, every transaction, every recommendation that had bypassed his father's oversight, and each path pointed back to the same place, the same person, his stepmother. But evidence alone wasn't enough, not for what he intended. So he waited, watched, gathered, until finally, the last piece surfaced, a witness, someone who should not have mattered, someone who had been overlooked for years, but who had seen enough, heard enough, to remember. The night his mother died had not been an accident, not entirely. Manipulation, pressure, calculated. Interference that pushed events just far enough out of control to become fatal. Not direct murder, but no less responsible. And when the truth was laid out, piece by piece, the reaction was exactly as expected. His father didn't explode, didn't deny, didn't defend. He went quiet, the kind of quiet that came before something irreversible. Is this true? He asked, not looking at Soren, but at the woman who had stood beside him for years, and for the first time, she didn't answer immediately, because the evidence didn't leave room for denial, only for desperation. And when she spoke, it wasn't to defend herself. It was to deflect, to twist, to shift blame. But it was too late, far too late, because everything she had built had already begun to collapse. And Noel, who had stood in the shadow of it all, who had benefited from every decision, every manipulation, watched it fall apart in real time, his expression tightening, then cracking, because this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Not like this, not so completely. And when his mother turned, when the truth settled fully into place, when the consequences became real, everything broke at once. Anger, fear, humiliation twisting into something unstable. Something volatile, and Noel's gaze snapped to Soren. Sharp, burning. "This is your fault," he said, voice unsteady but rising. "You did this." And Soren didn't respond, didn't deny it, because there was nothing to deny, and that silence only made it worse, because Noel needed something to hold on to, something to blame, and when he didn't get it, something inside him snapped, completely this time. "You think you've won?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it, only something hollow. "You think this is over?" His eyes flickered, darker now, more dangerous. "You took everything." And that was when the line was crossed, not spoken, but decided, because in that moment, Noel stopped being someone who reacted and became someone who acted, and there was only one direction left for him to go, and he didn't go alone, because Riven, already unstable, already slipping further from control, didn't need much to be pushed, only a direction, only a reason, and Noel gave him both, not gently, not carefully, but effectively, aligning their anger, their resentment, their need to reclaim something they believed had been taken, and by the time Soren stepped away from the ruins of what had once been his family, the next threat had already begun to form, quieter, sharper, more dangerous than anything that had come before. They didn't stop after losing everything. They broke past restraint, and once that line was crossed, nothing else mattered, not consequences, not image, not even survival, because Noel no longer had anything left to protect, and Riven no longer had anything left to control. So what remained was simple and dangerous. Revenge for one, possession for the other. And together it became something far more unstable than either of them alone. Noel moved first, his mind sharp despite the chaos inside him. Building a plan out of anger and desperation, watching, tracking, waiting for the right moment to strike. While Riven followed with a different purpose entirely, less calculated, more obsessive, because in his mind Soren was not someone he had lost, but someone who had been taken, and that belief twisted everything, made every action feel justified, inevitable, and when Noel approached him, when he laid out a way to corner Soren, Riven didn't question it, because it aligned with what he wanted. To take him back, no matter what it cost. They moved quickly, too quickly, believing speed would give them advantage, not realizing that every step had already been anticipated, because Soren had never stopped watching them, not since the first crack appeared. Every movement mapped, every contact traced, every decision predicted, and when they finally acted, when they chose the place, the time, the method, they believed they had control, believed they had removed every interference, believed they had forced the situation into their favor, but what they had actually done was step exactly where they had been led. Soren didn't avoid them, didn't change course, didn't resist, because this was never about escaping danger, it was about defining it, about exposing it completely. And when they confronted him, when Noel stepped forward first, voice sharp, unstable, "You took everything from me," and Riven followed, eyes fixed entirely on him. "Come back," something in between command and plea. "This isn't how it's supposed to be." Soren didn't react the way they expected, didn't deny, didn't argue, only looked at them with calm clarity, because every word they spoke was exactly what he needed. Every step they took another confirmation, and when Noel's control finally snapped, when his voice rose, when the threat became explicit, Soren answered at last, quiet, steady, "You're right." And both of them paused, just long enough for the shift to begin. "It isn't over." And then everything changed in an instant. The sound came first, precise, controlled, and the space. They believed isolated, filled with movement, not chaos, but execution. Enforcement stepping in with exact timing, not reacting, but following a sequence already set in place, because this had never been a trap for Soren. It had always been a trap for them. Every word recorded, every action documented, every intention exposed without room for denial. And Noel understood it first. The realization hitting all at once, collapsing the structure he had clung to, leaving nothing but raw panic beneath. Because this time there was no manipulation left, no escape to construct, and Riven, who had been driven by something far less rational, didn't resist at first, didn't fight, because the moment forced reality through the distortion in his mind, forced him to see that Soren had never belonged to him, that the version he kept chasing had never truly existed in this life, and that truth broke through just enough to stop him. Soren didn't move as they were restrained, didn't step forward or back. Only watched, because this wasn't victory in the way others would see it. It was correction, a system returning to order after deviation. And when Noel looked at him again, when the last of his composure shattered, there was no accusation left, only something hollow, because he finally understood. This had never been reaction, it had always been design, and Soren had simply allowed them to walk into it. When it was over, when the space cleared and silence returned, Soren exhaled slowly, not from relief, but from completion, because this part of the timeline was closed, and only after everything ended, only after the reports were delivered and the details reached him, did Alaric learn what had happened. And the moment he did, the reaction was immediate, not explosive, but far more dangerous, controlled anger tightening into something sharp and undeniable as he looked at Soren. "You put yourself in that position," he said, voice low, steady, but carrying weight, not accusation without reason, but something far closer to restraint breaking. That was unnecessary. And Soren met his gaze without hesitation. It was efficient, he replied, calm as ever, and that only made the silence heavier, because logic didn't erase what had almost happened, didn't reduce the risk he had taken. And for a moment Alaric said nothing, his gaze fixed, sharper than before he stepped closer, not forceful, but firm enough to remove any distance, his hand settling at Soren's waist with quiet finality. "Don't do it again," he said, not raised, not harsh, but absolute, because this was not negotiation, not strategy. It was something far more personal, and Soren didn't argue, didn't deflect, only answered, just as steady, "Then make sure I don't have to." And something shifted in that moment, not conflict, not disagreement, but alignment, because they both understood what that meant, and this time, the future that had once been taken from him was no longer something he needed to chase. It was something he had already secured. The aftermath didn't settle this time. It ended, clean and absolute, leaving no space for reversal, because when the evidence was presented, it was no longer suspicion, no longer theory, but undeniable truth. Soren's stepmother no longer held on to her composure, no longer able to hide behind carefully chosen words or strategic silence, because everything had been exposed, every transaction, every internal manipulation, every decision that had slowly hollowed out the company laid out in full. And most importantly, the witness stepped forward, voice unsteady but unwavering, recounting exactly what had happened years ago, how she interfered, how she pushed events just far enough beyond control, and how Soren's mother's death was no longer an accident. The room fell into complete silence, not because they didn't understand, but because there was nothing left to deny. And this time, the one who collapsed was not Soren, but the woman who had once believed she controlled everything. Noel reacted first, unable to maintain the calm facade any longer, stepping forward as his voice broke. "That's not true. This is all because of you." He pointed directly at Soren, as if blaming loudly enough could restore what had been lost, but no one responded, no one believed him. And that was the moment he truly lost everything, when his father's gaze, once indulgent, once trusting, no longer saw him as a son, but as part of the mistake. The decision followed immediately, without delay, without negotiation. Both mother and son were taken away in full view, stripped of status, position, and every advantage they once relied on. And this time, there would be no return. When the door closed behind them, only Soren and his father remained. The distance between them, once widened by years of manipulation, finally exposed for what it was. Nothing standing between them anymore. No one left to interfere, and his father didn't speak right away, because for the first time, he understood the full extent of his failure. "Soren," his voice lowered, heavier than before. "I let her." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I let your mother die." And this time he didn't look away, because he no longer had the right to. "I let her tear us apart, and I didn't see it." Regret was no longer a passing emotion. It settled into something heavier, something that forced him to face what he had done, and Soren watched him in silence for a long moment, not cold, not accusing, just clear, because this was where it ended. "Now you do," he said, calm but final, and that was enough, because this time, his father didn't argue, didn't defend himself, only nodded, slowly, accepting everything he had failed to see before, and for the first time, they stood on the same side. But outside, one final issue remained unresolved. Riven Ashford. When the evidence against him surfaced, when his actions towards Soren were formally acknowledged, the Ashford family reacted immediately, moving to shield him, to reduce the consequences, to preserve his position, because he was still their heir, and that was not something they would easily abandon. But this time, they misjudged one person, Alaric Ashford. He had not intervened earlier, had not appeared during the confrontation, but when the family began to move to protect Riven, he stepped in, and one decision was enough. Every form of support backing Riven was cut off completely. No exceptions, no loopholes, projects removed, alliances dissolved. Influence erased overnight as if it had never existed. "What are you doing?" someone demanded, but Alaric didn't need to explain. His gaze alone ended the question. "He will take responsibility for what he has done," he said evenly, "under the law." And this time, no one opposed him, because they understood. This was not negotiation, it was a decision. With every form of protection removed, Riven was left exposed. No power, no position, no family to shield him. And for the first time, he truly faced the consequences of his actions, not with rage, not with resistance, but with the cold realization that there was nothing left to hold on to. And when everything was over, when the system returned to order, Soren stood in a space that finally felt clear, no longer surrounded by invisible threats, no longer carrying the weight of unseen manipulation, because every piece had been removed, every risk accounted for, and this time, nothing remained that could destroy him from within. Behind him, Alaric stepped forward, not asking, not confirming, because he already knew the outcome, his hands settling at Soren's waist, drawing him closer in a quiet, natural motion, not control, acknowledgement. "It's over," he said, and Soren didn't correct him, didn't adjust the statement, only replied simply, "Yeah," because this time, it truly was, not temporary, not partial, but complete, and the future ahead. There was no one left who could tear it apart again. Time didn't slow down. It simply stopped pressing against him, and that was the difference Soren noticed first. Not a sudden peace, not a dramatic shift, just the quiet absence of something that had always been there before. The constant tension, the need to anticipate, to prepare, to stay one step ahead of everything that could go wrong. And when it disappeared, he didn't react immediately, because for someone who had lived in that state for so long, stillness wasn't something you trusted right away, but the stillness remained, day after day, unchanged, and eventually, it became real. The Ashford estate carried the same structure it always had, controlled, precise, untouched by chaos. But the atmosphere within it had changed in a way no one outside could see, because Alaric hadn't become softer, hadn't become less decisive or less feared. But with Soren, there was no longer distance to maintain, no longer a line they both kept intact out of necessity. Every glance lingered longer, every touch carried intention, every moment between them existed because they chose it, not because it was required. It wasn't a single moment that changed everything. It was the accumulation of many small ones, until one night, when there was nothing left to interrupt them, Alaric reached out before Soren could step away, his hand closing around his wrist. "Steady, grounding, stay," he said, and this time Soren didn't even consider leaving. The space between them closing naturally, Alaric's hand sliding from his wrist to his waist, drawing him closer with a certainty that no longer needed permission, and Soren responded just as easily, fingers catching at his collar, holding him there without hesitation. "This was supposed to be an arrangement," Alaric said, his voice lower than usual, stripped of control but not of clarity. "And it should have stayed that way." A brief pause, not doubt, but acknowledgement. "But I don't want it to." And Soren didn't interrupt, because he understood exactly what it meant for Alaric to say that. "I don't want you because it works, or because it's convenient," Alaric continued, his gaze steady, his hand tightening slightly at Soren's waist. "I want you because it's you." And that was enough, because this time Soren didn't need to calculate his response, didn't need to maintain distance or control, his hand lifting to rest against Alaric's chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his palm. Then don't let go, he said quietly, and the moment settled into something final, something chosen, and when Alaric kissed him, there was no restraint left, no hesitation, only certainty, and Soren answered him the same way, because this was no longer an agreement they upheld. It was something they had already stepped into. The future unfolded without announcement, and when their first child was born, the shift was immediate, not in the way the world saw Alaric, but in the way he existed within it, still controlled, still untouchable, but no longer distant. From the life he had built, his presence around his family carrying something instinctive, protective, unwavering, and the child grew surrounded by that stability, by a structure that had already proven it wouldn't break. Time moved forward the way it always did, steady and indifferent, and their life expanded naturally, one child becoming two, then three, each one different, each one carrying something of both of them. And Soren no longer needed to anticipate collapse, no longer needed to prepare for loss, because there was nothing left that could reach them the way it once had. Alaric's condition was never declared cured, never reduced to something simple, but it no longer defined him, no longer overshadowed the life he lived, because what remained was control, stability, and time, more time than anyone had expected, more than anyone had predicted. And the man who had once been quietly spoken of as someone who wouldn't last remained exactly where he was, steady, present, watching his children grow, watching the life he had built with his own hands become something real. And Soren, who had once lived every moment preparing for the worst, now stood beside him without looking back, because there was nothing left behind worth returning to. The past had been closed, the future secured, and everything in between, every decision, every risk, every step taken, had led exactly here, not to perfection, but to something far more valuable, something they had chosen, something they had built, and this time, nothing was going to take it away. Extra chapter, Alaric's POV, past life. He did not remember the exact day he first noticed Soren, only that it happened long after the marriage had already been decided, long after Soren had become Riven Ashford's spouse in name, placed neatly into a position that should have secured his future, but instead seemed to diminish it in ways most people failed to recognize. Alaric had seen countless arrangements like that before, alliances built on calculation, maintained through obligation, and he had never paid them more attention than necessary, because they rarely deserved it. But Soren was different, not in a way that drew immediate attention, not loud, not eager to prove himself, but precise, measured, controlled in a way that didn't match his age or his position, and that was what made Alaric look twice. The first time they spoke, it was brief, incidental, nothing that should have mattered, but Soren answered without hesitation, without trying to impress, and more importantly, without making the mistake of underestimating him. And that alone was enough to earn Alaric's acknowledgement, subtle but real. He didn't interfere. After that, didn't step into Soren's life or attempt to redirect it, because it wasn't his place, and more importantly, because Soren did not appear to need saving, not at first, but observation had a way of revealing what appearances concealed, and it didn't take long for Alaric to understand that Soren's position was not what it seemed, that the marriage he had entered into was not one of mutual respect, but something far more unbalanced, and Riven, who lacked both the discipline and the clarity to recognize what he had been given, treated it accordingly. Alaric did not step in, even when he saw it clearly, even when the imbalance became obvious, because intervention would have created consequences Soren might not be able to control, and Alaric did not make decisions that placed others in unstable positions without certainty of outcome. So instead, he watched, and when necessary, he adjusted what he could without drawing attention. When Riven crossed lines too openly, when his behavior became careless enough to affect more than just his personal affairs, Alaric responded. Not for Soren, not directly, but through correction, projects reassigned, authority reduced in ways that could not be traced back to a single cause, consequences applied where they could not be contested, and Riven, who never fully understood why certain doors began to close to him, simply assumed it was the natural result of his own choices. Soren, however, noticed, not the action itself, but the pattern behind it, and that was enough for Alaric to know that his judgment had been correct. Beyond that, The assistance he provided remained minimal, intentional, never enough to create dependency, only enough to remove unnecessary obstacles, an opportunity here, a shift there, small adjustments that allowed Soren to move forward on his own terms. Because anything more would have crossed a line Alaric had no intention of crossing. He did not stay close, did not create situations where their paths would intersect too often. But when they did, when conversations happened by chance or by necessity, Alaric found himself listening more than usual, not because Soren demanded attention, but because he did not. And that absence of need made everything he said more precise, more deliberate, and therefore more difficult to ignore. It was not attachment, not even interest in the way others might define it, but something quieter, something that settled in the background without requiring acknowledgement. And for a man who rarely allowed anything unnecessary to remain in his thoughts, that in itself was unusual. Time, however, was not something Alaric had in abundance, and that was one variable he could not control, his condition progressing as expected, silently, efficiently, without regard for what he might have preferred. And as it advanced, his focus narrowed further, decisions became sharper, priorities more defined, and anything that did not serve a clear purpose was discarded without hesitation. And yet, even then, Soren did not fully disappear from his awareness. He noticed the changes, subtle at first, then more pronounced, the pressure increasing around Soren, the environment tightening, the space he operated in becoming more restricted, more hostile, shaped by forces that worked quietly but effectively. And Alaric recognized the pattern for what it was: systematic removal, not immediate, not obvious, but inevitable. He could have intervened then, more directly, more forcefully, and for a brief moment, the thought did cross his mind, but intervention at that scale would have required commitment, not a single action but a series of them. And by that point, Alaric understood exactly how limited his time was, understood that anything he began, he might not be able to finish, and he did not start what he could not complete. So he chose restraint, not out of indifference, but out of calculation, and that was the decision that remained with him the longest. The last time he saw Soren, there was nothing outwardly different, no visible sign of collapse, no obvious indication that everything was already too far gone, but the absence was there, in the way Soren held himself, in the way he spoke, in the precision that had once felt effortless now carrying weight it hadn't before. And Alaric recognized it for what it was, not weakness, but pressure that had no release. He did not say anything about it, did not offer assistance he could not sustain, only observed, committed the moment to memory in the same way he did with everything else that mattered. And when he left, he did not look back, because there was nothing he could change at that point. His condition worsened quickly after that, not dramatically, but with certainty, each day removing options, narrowing outcomes, until the end was no longer theoretical but imminent. And even then, his thoughts did not linger on regret in the way others might expect, not on what he had lost, not on what he would not see, but on a single, unresolved variable he had chosen not to act on, not because it was the most important, but because it was the only one he had deliberately left unfinished. Soren did not belong to him, had never belonged to him, and that was not what remained. What remained was simpler, quieter, and perhaps more inconvenient than anything else: awareness, acknowledgement, and a question that had no answer, not in that life, not with the time he had been given. And when the end finally came, it was not dramatic, not marked by anything beyond what had always been expected, but even then, for a brief moment, there was the smallest flicker of thought, not of what could have been, but of what had been left undone, and then it was gone.